So we are going to use a tool called Firebase. And Firebase is actually a Google product. So firebase.google.com is the site for this guy. And so when you go there, you can get started for free and set up your account and all this crap. Ultimately, after you log into your account, you'll have this thing that says go to console. So it's going to take you to a place like this. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add a project. And let's call this guy Bootcamp. Okay. So now I have Firebase. Now what is Firebase? Firebase is something known as a real-time database. So let's kind of give us a little bit of a background in that. So Firebase is a real-time database. Well, whatever. It's also fits the category of something called a NoSQL database. This is similar to if you've heard of some other databases like MongoDB is a NoSQL database. If you don't know what I'm talking about there, it's not important. But for a long time, relational databases like MySQL, SQL Server, Oracle, DB2, these guys have kind of ruled the world of database, and these guys operate. They're SQL-based databases, and SQL is a data representation language for querying a database. You know, it's a programming language for requesting information from a database. All right. Now, without going too deep into this to save some time. Relational databases they became popular during a time where it was expensive to store stuff. So their whole goal was to minimize the footprint. You know, that you would store less data rather than more data. So they focused more on the structure of the data so that you wouldn't store the same two pieces of information more than once. Now we're in a different world. We care a lot more about speed and duplication of data so we don't lose data than we do about an extra terabyte or two, right? Data is not a problem anymore. We have plenty of storage. So now since we these SQL databases, these relational databases like Oracle and MySQL, they're still popular today. They haven't gone away because they've been around for a long time and they solve the problem they need to be solved. And there's plenty of software out there for working with them. But anything new, especially when we start getting into this world of cloud computing, right? And cloud computing is a very generic term that means my software uses resources that live on another computer. That's what cloud computing is. Whether it's storing crap on another computer or having another computer do number crunching for you. Maybe you're sending something up somewhere to do a video conversion and it downloads the converted file. These are all examples of cloud computing stuff. Well, as we've started to have to solve problems in the whole cloud computing world, we've had an opportunity to revisit databases and say, okay, well, rather than just keep using the databases that do still work, now we have lots and lots and lots of users hitting the same data for stuff at the same time, and maybe performance should be a higher priority than data footprint and stuff like that. So that's led to this rise of NoSQL databases, just the new kind of databases. Sometimes they're called data stores. Firebase takes this maybe one level, one additional level, where especially with our real-time, especially with the nature of applications that occur today, having data that updates in real time is very important. In fact, an example I usually use in class when I go into Firebase, and obviously we're compressing this into a pretty short period of time, so eventually you'll probably see this again, a longer-winded version. When you hear about So all of us have heard the phrase a chat server, right? Or a chat room. Okay, so the premise is that this is an old internet thing, right? Early days of the internet, people all go into the same room and they'll chat with each other, and that's easy stuff, right? The funny thing is that if I were to give you a homework assignment to implement a chat room that worked on a network and stuff like that, it's actually a very difficult problem to solve. Chat rooms require for a real-time chat room where you can allow 5 or 6 or 7 people to all talk simultaneously and have the screen update and on each of their consoles, it's a relatively difficult networking problem to solve. Firebase actually makes problems like that trivial because of their real-time nature. What Firebase does is it gives us a place in the sky to store our data. All right? So let's say that I have an app that is retrieving information from Firebase, and you have an app that's retrieving information from Firebase. And then you go and you update, you add a person. We're gonna have a screen that adds person to this, right? You add a person to it. As soon as you add a person to that database, because I'm connected to a real-time database, I can choose to let that guy let me know when there's new information. So he will automatically push the new information to me that he added. I don't have to go and check back every 30 seconds or something to see if there's anything new. Does that make sense? So this idea of a real-time database really solves a problem that historically has been a pretty difficult problem. Because if you have to think back, well, how often is too often? How often do I check? Do I use internet bandwidth to see if maybe there's new data available up there or something like that? So maintaining a consistent connection, it's almost like a phone call that we're maintaining between us and the database lets us know when there's a change. And similarly, if I update the database, you become aware of the change if you are interested. You don't have to be interested. You can choose to just get a snapshot of the database, one-time deal, and say, I'm good, and you don't want to know about updates. The next time the person launches the app, you'll get an update then. You might decide to have your app operate mostly offline if the data doesn't change very often. Okay, but that's the kind of animal Firebase is. Now, Firebase originally was owned by a different company. Google bought it several years ago, and another product I used to use, I still use it for some of my older projects, is a tool called Parse. From parse.com. They're shut down now. That was an interesting one because Facebook actually bought Parse and then shut them down. They didn't continue with it, but it's gone open source. So you can actually run your own Parse server now. But Parse is similar to Firebase from the NoSQL portion of it, but it was not real time. So Firebase is actually better. Now, what's really interesting with Firebase for mobile application development, the reason that I push it is, first of all, it's owned by Google. So it's probably going to be pretty compatible with Android, you might assume, right? It's also pretty easy to integrate in iOS. You'll see here in a few minutes. Well, hopefully we don't have any problems. Google has actually adopted Firebase, has replaced all of their old Android communication stuff with Firebase. So not only is Firebase their data storage, it's also for their push notifications. Okay, so Firebase push notifications are Android push notifications. And what's even better about that is it's also compatible with Apple push notifications. So if you write an app that has push notifications in it, you can go two different ways. You can decide, and so if we kind of go back, before Firebase, if you had an iPhone and an Android app that both did the same thing, and you wanted them both to have push notifications, you would have had to go and implement push notifications the Apple way, which is not an impossible problem, but it's significantly more cryptic than the stuff you've seen us do tonight. It is a harder problem because you're kind of doing networky type stuff. Then you'd have to also use Google Cloud Messaging, GCM, to do Google's push notifications. They weren't compatible with each other. So you'd have to implement two different systems. With Firebase, you can actually write all your push notifications as Firebase push notifications because it's compatible with both iOS and Android. Effectively, you get to abandon Apple's push notification system because Firebase does it for you. Firebase is implementing their iOS side in terms of Apple's stuff, but you don't have to worry about it. So lots of advantages of Firebase. Okay, so that's what Firebase is. I can go ahead and add to this that this is also a third party, has a third party API for talking to Firebase. So Firebase is a database in the cloud. We have, in this case, an iPhone app, and we want the two of those dudes to talk to each other. Okay, so there must be a programming interface that exists for us to make our app talk to Firebase. All right, now there's this idea of something called a RESTful API, which I'm not going to talk about too much right now, just because of time. So pretty much any third-party API that exists today will have a RESTful API. So in a worst-case scenario, if there is not a specific library for the language of the platform you're working with, like there wasn't a Swift library or there wasn't a Java library, you could implement your own version of it using just their normal RESTful API, whatever that is. If you haven't heard of that before, don't worry about it. Okay. Firebase has both an iOS library as well as an Android library. So we don't have to do that. It has a tool for it. All right. Now, again, comparing iOS to Android, how to integrate third-party APIs into our apps. For iOS, we can do it the old school way and actually manually enter it in there. We're not even going to discuss that. iOS, what the cool kids use is a tool called CocoaPods. And that's what we're going to look at today. For Android, it's more cryptic, but it is actually built in. Android has a package manager called Gradle. All right, so we're going to do Firebase with iOS. I actually find it easier to integrate Firebase with iOS personally because I've used CocoaPods a lot. But Firebase for Android really doesn't require you to do anything special other than drop two little lines into your Gradle scripts. And those Gradle scripts then automatically download the Firebase code necessary to make it work with your project. All right, so it's more integrated into Android, but it's also maybe a little bit more hidden. You don't really see it as part of your project, where here we will. Okay, so we're going to use a tool called CocoaPods. Now, this is not something that Apple made. Instead, the way CocoaPods works is this converts a Xcode project into an Xcode workspace, which is a combination of two projects, your project and a pods project. The pods project has all of the most up-to-date APIs that you have chosen to include in your pod file. And for us today, we're just going to be using Firebase. All right, so one of those guys, but we can have 30 pods in our pod file, and then one command updates all of those and integrates it into our project. All right, so once you learn CocoaPods, you get past that initial learning curve. It's pretty easy to work with. All right, so let's go here I'm going to go to cocoapods.org. So this is where you can go for finding different CocoaPods, searching for stuff. But you can also, to install CocoaPods for Xcode 7 or Xcode 8, you just go out to the command line and you do sudo gem install CocoaPods. I've already done it on my computer, so it's already there, but you'll just do it right out here from the terminal. Sudo gem install CocoaPods. The sudo says run this as system administrator. So you might have to put in your Mac password. All right, this is Mac only. And then it'll download CocoaPods. Gem is actually something that comes with your computer. If you have any of the recent versions of the Mac OS, that's a Ruby. It's a Ruby package management library, Gem. So you don't have to worry about that. You'll already have that. And then CocoaPods is the project we want to install. Once you have that, then the next steps occur. Okay? So what I'm going to do is, I think I put my project actually on the desktop. Actually, what I'm going to do, just so I don't get a whole bunch of extra files out my desktop, I'm going to actually close this real quick, close Xcode, because I did put this on my desktop. Here's my Bootcamp iOS. Oh, no, actually, we're okay. I can keep it on the desktop. So I'll open this back up. All right, so I'll move into the directory where I see my Xcode project file. Okay? Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do pod init. Okay? And what that's going to do is it's going to give me this file in here called pod file that I can put stuff into. Okay? So this is CocoaPod stuff right now. I'm going to go back into Firebase now because Firebase actually tells you how to do all this. So we're going to pretend like we're going to be doing this in Firebase. So I'll go into Firebase and we're going to say I want to add Firebase. So I've already created this new project called Bootcamp. I'm going to say I'm going to add Firebase to my iOS app. So I click on that guy and it says, what's your bundle ID? Okay, so just so I make sure I get it right, so things don't get confused, I'm going to go in here. I'm going to go to General. Here's my bundle identifier. This guy right here. All right. Mine happened to default to something from one of my clients or something like that. So just make sure you grab the right bundle identifier. So I'll go ahead and paste that in there. I can give it an app nickname if I want. I don't need to. I can also give it an App Store ID if I want. I don't need to. So I'm just going to say register this app. Okay. Now what it did for me is it created this plist file. Without going into too much detail about this, this is just a whole bunch of name value pairs that allows my app to connect to the correct project on Firebase. Just a bunch of keys. Okay, so rather than giving me 5 pieces of information that I need to go and put in a certain order somewhere in my project, it just gives me this file and it just works. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and download this file. So it's downloaded here. And I actually need to I'm going to delete that here. Actually, I won't delete it. I'm just going to name it the right name because I already had another version of it in there. There's the old one. I'll move that to trash, then I'll rename the new one. All right, so now I have my Google Services file. Okay. So now I'm going to go over here to Xcode. And here's that file that was just downloaded. I'm just going to drag it into my project. Now, a very important thing. Whenever you put something into your iPhone project, notice that mine is defaulted to being checked, but usually it's not checked. I just do this often so it's remembered by preference. Make sure that this checkbox is checked. Copy items if needed. Because what that does is it brings this file into my project as a copy, rather than creating a symbolic link to it in my downloads folder. Which would mean if I then sent my project to somebody, they wouldn't have that file because they don't have a downloads folder with that file in it. That makes sense? So make sure it copies everything in so it's all part of your project. So I'll just hit finish. So now that plist file is now part of my project. So let's go back here. So I did that. I followed the directions, I downloaded it, then I moved it into my Xcode project. So now I'll do continue. All right, I already did the pod init part, right? You saw me do that. Now I need to do pod Firebase core. I need to put that inside of that pod file. So I can edit that with any text editor I want. I'm just going to do it here from the command line. So I'm going to do vi pod file. All right, and there is my Firebase core pod. So I'm only going to have one pod for this. So I'll go ahead and save that. So I've added that one line to my pod file. And then I'm going to do pod install. And what pod install does, so I'm in this directory, I have a pod file, and I have my Xcode project that's here. And for right now, I'm going to go ahead and close my Xcode project because I'm actually going to be going into something different here in a second. When I do pod install, what it's going to do is it's going to read from my pod file what pods I want to install. It's then going to grab the generic pod project, download all the pods that I've asked it to install, make sure I have the most up-to-date version of these guys, and then it's going to generate an Xcode workspace for me. That is a combination of this new pods project it just built for me and the project I already had, so that I have access to all my pods inside of my current project. The whole purpose of CocoaPods is it does all the work of integrating different third-party libraries into your iOS app so that you don't have to manually do it for each one and then keep them each up to date. CocoaPods also allows you to specify a version for a particular pod. So for example, if I know there's a new version of one of my pods that will end up breaking my code, maybe I do something an older way, I can specify in my pod file which version of that pod I want, so that anytime I do a pod update, it never updates it past the version that I say it works for. So it allows you to make sure you apply all bug fixes and stuff like that to your project for any third-party APIs that you're not in control of, without possibly breaking your project by updating to something that you have to now go write new code for. All right, so I'll do a pod install. So it's installing Firebase Analytics, blah, blah, blah. Don't worry about the warnings things. It's not a big deal. All right, so it did what it needed to do. That's all that green stuff. If I do ls here, notice that I have a new thing here called Bootcamp iOS Workspace. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go ahead and go into my Bootcamp iOS folder here. And instead of opening the Xcode project from now on, I'm going to open the workspace. The workspace gives me access to my project as well as this pods project that has inside of it my Firebase stuff that it downloaded for me. Does that make sense? That's what CocoaPods does. It's a package manager. If you've ever done Node.js programming, NPM does the same thing. If you've ever done Python web programming, pip does the same thing. Gem does the same thing. Prior to programming stuff, if you've ever used Linux, apt-get does the same thing. Yum does the same thing. Yast for SUSE Linux does the same thing. These are all package managers that help make your life easier by doing all of this kind of tedious stuff for you, so all you have to do is focus on the programming side of things. Does that make sense? That's what CocoaPods is. There are other ways of doing this other than CocoaPods, but that's becoming less and less true. 8 months ago, Firebase would have had two options. They would have said, well, you can do it the easy way and use CocoaPods, or you can download our latest source code from GitHub and do this and do this and drop it into your project and change these 3 lines so they say this for this version of Swift and they say something else for this other version of Swift. A lot of stuff you have to do. This makes life easier. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to do a quick build on this. So that's a Command B, or you just go to Product and do Build, and just make sure that all my pods build. And for right now, they should They should build. There was a transition I mentioned earlier when Apple randomly in 1 week, it all happened the same week, Apple released OS X Sierra. They released Swift 3.0 and they released Xcode 8. All in the same week, which broke tons and tons and tons and tons of projects. And it made things even worse if you're using Cocoa Pods, because a lot of the pods you might have been using hadn't updated to Swift 3. So you either had to abandon Cocoa Pods or you had to update pods for, you had to like manually update code in pods while you were waiting for the actual developer to change their code base to have Swift 3 syntax. It was not good, but now everything's caught up, so we're fine. Okay, so we now have integrated Firebase into our project. So I've done all these steps. I'll hit continue. So here's for Swift. Notice, remember at the very beginning, we talked about that app delegate class. I said that's the only guy we're going to be using here. So they give us a choice, Swift and Objective-C. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to import Firebase at the top in there. So actually, I'm gonna steal that guy. So I'll go into, I'm not in my pods folder. So pods folder, you can leave this guy closed. The only time you ever might want to come in here is if you want to change something in your pod file. All right. Now you don't need to use VI anymore because now it's part of your workspace. But I'm going to go in here. I'm going to go to my app delegate. This is just my normal project. This is nothing new. This is the same thing we saw before. I'm going to go to up top here. I'm going to say import Firebase. So the fact that that showed up lets me know that the pod file thing worked. All right. It knows about Firebase, and it wouldn't have known about Firebase had that not worked. Then down here in did finish launching with options, before I return true, it wants me to call configure on this object called FireApp. And what does that guy do? He does the magic of reading this plist file that's in here. It has all these big, long, special, unique keys and stuff like that for reading stuff from the database. Talking to my specific database, not some other person's database on Firebase where I'm getting somebody else's data. Okay? So that's how you integrate Firebase into your application. So I'll hit finish. Cool. I now have Firebase in my application. I'm ready to start querying stuff. So let's go over to our database here. So first of all, I've just advertised Firebase, I'll make this a little bit bigger here, as a database. And that used to be the case. But notice now that Google took it over and has, Google has made Firebase their version of Amazon Web Services. It's their one-stop shop for cloud stuff. So you can handle authentication with this, real-time database, storing of things, images and that kind of stuff, hosting web stuff, cloud functions. You can actually also test on multiple devices through their test lab. I haven't worked with that before. Push notifications. And I don't know how the remote config thing works, but point is that you can do a lot with Firebase. This is a professional level tool. So having a background in this will benefit you greatly. All right. Well, we're just interested in database right now. So I'm going to go to my database here and notice I currently have an empty database. Now I'm going to go to my rules up here and notice the default rules is it says authorization can't be equal to null. That means only authenticated users are allowed to read and write from the database. Well, if you read the email I sent earlier with the hackathon teams, I kind of indicated in there that I strongly encourage you not to use authentication in your apps. Not because authentication is bad, but authentication is time consuming and it's something you can definitely do. Right? There's plenty of tutorials for doing authentication. Why burn 2 hours of your time implementing something that really doesn't add any features to your app? So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to say, might need to cheat here real quick. I think it's just either public or true. Firebase, public, read, write. Just get it right the first time. I think it's just public. No, read is true, write is true. Okay. All right, so read and write is both true. Now, having said this, this is not a highly secure situation. Okay, people will still need to know the unique ID and have access to that stuff inside of a project in order to talk to your database and change stuff and things like that. But this would not be something you'd want to do in a shipped project, right? But we want to make this quick and dirty and not require authentication, so we're going to make our database read and write for everybody. That is, everybody who has that plist file. Okay, so I'll go ahead and publish those changes to update the security rules. Your rules are defined as public. Anyone can read and write your database. Are you sure you want to do this? Yeah. Make sense? Okay. So that probably isn't the thing you want to show your boss the first day of work, but maybe something you want to do for a hackathon. Something like that. Okay, so now I'm going to actually go to Docs for Firebase. And we're going to go to, for iOS, Getting Started Guide. And over here, so the documentation is pretty good. I'm going to go to Real-Time Database. For iOS, I'm going to say Read and Write Data, because we want to be able to write a piece of data into our database, right? From our add person form. Okay, and notice they give you both Objective-C and Swift stuff. All right, so I'm going to need to create a variable of my Firebase database reference, and then I'll grab the database and get the reference. So for example, I can, so I might have a variable called ref. Then I can get the child of that. So let me show this by example. So I'm going to start off. I'll go to the top of my code here. I think I just have to import Firebase. So we're going to go to add person. I'm going to say, so this is the page where we want to store stuff in our database. So I'm going to say import Firebase. And then I'll go ahead and give myself a variable of type Firebase database reference. Okay, he doesn't know about that guy. So is that Firebase core? All right, I think I need to, must have separated these things again. Let me just do this, then this. So this is Firebase core. I'm also going to do Firebase database. Okay, so I'm going to add a second pod here because I don't think the database stuff came with normal Firebase core. So I'll come in here and I'll do pod install. This went ahead and grabbed Firebase database for me. So now I have that guy. I'll go back into our add person code. Now I should be able to import Firebase database. There we go. And now he knows about that Firebase database reference. All right. This is actually something they probably didn't update that tutorial because, like I mentioned a few minutes ago, Firebase used to just be a database, or mostly just be a database. I think they had authentication pretty early on, but now they're a lot more. So Firebase core is kind of the core utilities of Firebase, and you choose which stuff within there you want to use. Here we're using database. We had to add that pod in. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and grab this line of code that we'll do inside of UDidLoad. So we'll go ahead and define our reference here. Okay, so I'm setting, so I have a variable up here called ref. It's of type fire database reference. And it already knows about my particular database because of that plist file. And that was all set up for me from my app delegate when I told my app when it first launched. As soon as my app finished launching, I said, go ahead and configure Firebase right there. Okay, so an add person VC, this gives me my link to my top level of my database. Now, when I go and I save something, before I dismiss stuff here, I want to actually save the first name and last name that was in there. I want to save it in my database. Okay? So down here, it tells you to save something, you can create a child and you can set the value at that child. And this guy is actually a dictionary. So let me show you here what we're going to do. So I'm going to come down here. When you hit the OK button before we dismiss stuff, in fact, I'll just get rid of this dismiss stuff for a second. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to say let val to save equal. I'm going to have a dictionary here, and this guy is going to be fname is going to be equal to self dot first name tf dot text, and then lname is going to be equal to self dot last name tf dot text. Okay, so that's going to be the data that I want to save. Then I'm going to say self dot ref, which is my database, dot child, and I'm going to actually do child. Let's do it this way. Dot child. I'm going to call this guy people. And then I'm going to say child by auto ID. And you'll see what I mean by this in a second. It'll be easier to show you after you see the result than it is to explain it right now. Okay, so think of this, if you worked with a database before, I'm going to have a table called people. And inside of that table called people, I'm going to have a bunch of people, first name and last name pairs. But each one of them is going to have a unique identifier. That's this auto ID thing. Okay, so I'm going to say, go to my default database reference, go to the people child, the table called people, if you will, and then give me a unique identifier. And I want to set the value there to my val to save. Okay, and actually, let me... So you can actually set the value with a completion block. I'm going to go ahead and do that because I did mention earlier that we'd have closures. So I could just say set the value, then make the thing disappear if I want. But I'm going to say set the value to val to save. And then my completion block, this is the guy that will get called once it's done saving. So I can ask the question, if error is equal to nil, meaning there was not a problem, then I'll go ahead and say self dot dismiss animated true, completion nil. Otherwise, I can raise some sort of error message alert or something like that. So maybe I'll just do a quick print problem saving, and then not dismiss the screen because it didn't actually successfully save. Does that make sense? So this one line right here says, go to my database, go to the people table, give me a unique identifier for a new record in my people table, and go ahead and set it to the current first name and last name that was entered in. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and run this. And we're going to go to that add screen. Okay, and this is in our OK action. So right now our OK action, we only have one button. We have an OK and save. Oh, nice. And we're getting pretty close to done. What I'll actually do is on the getting new data side, rather than actually put it into the table view, I'll just show it to you that you're receiving the data, so you know it's there. And then you would just say, instead of putting first name, last name, you just pull the data you want and put it into those cells, and that'll get us all the everywhere we need to be. Start running. All right, so I'll go to screen 3. We're going to add a new thing. I'll do Mike Littman. We'll hit save. It's going to say we're about to save Mike Littman. As soon as I hit OK here, it's going to go to my database and it's going to try to save the thing. And it must have worked, right? Because that thing dismissed. So now we'll go over here to Firebase. We'll go to my database. There's people. There's my unique ID. There's Mike Littman. I go in here again, okay, and I say Dave Littman, and I hit save. We say okay. Here's Dave Littman. Pretty easy. Saving in the cloud. Way easier than using core data. That's why I never use core data. All right. So that's saving it there. Now what if I want to retrieve it? And this is where the real-time database thing comes in. This is where maybe the cool thing comes in. So we're going to go back here. I'm going to do this in my, I'm going to steal, actually I'm going to steal this. Because in our my list, this would be the guy that would show the information, but I'm not actually going to put it in the table right now. I'll just show us how you would get it. So I'll go ahead and I'll import Firebase database. I'll give myself that global variable for my reference, and then in view did load, I'll set ref equal to my default reference. All right. So now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to create a listener. So I'm going to say ref.child, and I'm interested in people. Observe, and then I get to do an event type. So the event type I'm going to observe is a child added, right? Child change can happen as well, but I want to observe whenever something brand new shows up here, okay? So I'm going to say child added, and this guy is actually going to give me a snapshot. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to print out that snapshot that it gives me. I'm going to put a breakpoint here, that we can actually explore it a little bit, okay? Now, one of the other things I've talked about before is the observer design pattern, okay, in some of the classes, if you guys have had some of the later classes with me. So in that guy, what I'm saying is I want this particular page, this My List TVC, I want him to observe my database people, specifically people. And I want to know whenever anything is added to people, go ahead and call this code right here. Initially, it'll call the code showing me all the stuff that's currently in there. All right? But then what we'll do is we'll go to that second page where we add something, and you're going to see this guy automatically gets called. That's that idea where the database lets me know that something happened. Okay. Then we'll go and we'll manually add something. Actually, manually might be difficult with our unique IDs, but whatever. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and run this. You're going to see that it's going to initially show us the snapshot. It's going to give us a dictionary of stuff that we could load into our table if we wanted to spend another 5 minutes. It wouldn't be the end of the world. We just have to take it from a snapshot into that. Okay, so I'll go to launch screen 3. Oops. That guy does happen, doesn't it? Oh, I bet you. Oh, okay. Yeah, so child added doesn't do the initial part that I thought. So I'm going to go ahead and create something new, and you'll see it update. That will just show you that part right now. So we'll say Bob Smith. I'll hit save. Now it's actually saved. Notice that this guy gets notified. So if I walk past that, we'll see the print statement. There's my Bob Smith that it just got notified that was put in there. What I'm actually going to do here is instead of child added, I'm going to do .value. So that actually does it for anything. So this will show me my initial. Now I have 3 people in here when I first come in. So this will initially observe those things. Isn't that the way you do it? Observe. That's the single event type. No, this should be the. Was it timing out? Yeah, I think it's trying to observe it. This should initially get my 3 people that are in there and then get called again for each new person that gets added. Or really any change. If somebody gets updated or something like that. Let's run this again. I'm actually going to get myself to there. Okay, so I got that. Run this again. Let's let it cook for a second. Oh, he must have separated it. Okay, this is fine. So I'll do add, child added there. So that's whenever a new child is added. Then I'm going to actually observe another event. So I'm going to say child. This actually maybe makes sense if it works this way. So I'm going to observe a single event of type dot value with this snapshot. And then I'll print out that initial snapshot. So this is something I'm only going to observe one time. We've already seen this one down here. This observes whenever a new child was added. All right, so we'll listen to that too. So this guy should happen the first time, and it should show me all the children that are in there. I'm observing that once. I just kind of want that initial event of stuff. And then we should be done. So there's that screen. Oh, you're killing me here. Playlist. Everything was going so smoothly. Oh, interesting. Didn't we add a Bob Smith earlier? Oh, the internet's down. I'm pretty sure the first thing I wrote would have worked. Because the way it's always worked before is when you try to observe an event, like say child added, it initially observes the full database of the path that we picked. And then any new child that's added, it'll give us. It is possible, I'm not sure when the internet went down, and actually this would be preferable for me, that we can go ahead and observe a one-time event, not something we're going to keep listening for. Just give me the current data, and then on an ongoing basis, I want to observe whenever a child is added. Separating those two things, I think, makes some sense, but it works one of those two ways. Our internet is not working, so because it there we go, because it is a real-time database, so we would have seen Bob Smith in there had it updated, right? So let's just say that's good. We kind of get that it's not very difficult to talk to the cloud and read from the cloud. What was the setup with the CocoaPods was the slightly difficult part, right? Okay, there'll be several people at the hackathon, depending on whose team you're on, who have worked with CocoaPods before. Nick Largent has, Josh Curcio has, I have, Blade will be there, the Chinese guy. He's worked with it. So there'll be several people there who've worked with it. So if your team wants to do something with that and you don't have somebody who's done it before, well, you've done it, right? You've done CocoaPods before.
390.
Yeah, so there'll be people there who's worked with it. So that's really the learning curve, is getting CocoaPods on your machine. And once you have it working, adding a new pod like we did when I had to throw the database one in there, it took 20 seconds. And then we had a whole new library, just worked. All right, well, I'll go ahead and save this, and I'll upload it when I can. So sorry we couldn't get to the Android stuff, but hopefully you kind of saw that they're the same, right? And, trust me, getting Firebase in Android is actually easier than iOS, even though I don't like it as much.
So Curcio really did get our group. I saw it in our group. We're doing the HoloLens.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so.
I think I don't know if that was an